to start by asking you about how you got into engineering and your background. I understand that your father was an aerospace engineer.
My father was actually a physicist by training, and I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama. Anybody know Huntsville? I just visited there. It was a crazy place to live. It was a town of 15,000. It was a small cotton town of 15,000 before 3,500 German immigrants came in from actually Operation Paperclip was sequestering all these German rocket scientists, and they were brought over from White Sands, New Mexico, and Fort Bliss to start the rocket program for Redstone Arsenal and later NASA. And it was quite a crazy time to live, where they were trying to figure out how to put guidance systems into rockets and do the impossible, like put a man on the moon when we were losing the space race to the Russians. So the idea that you could do something bold, do something crazy, do something that will probably never work, which is part of the optimism and environment of Huntsville. And it was contagious. You could do something crazy like put a man on the moon, which nobody thought was possible when John F. Kennedy talked about it in 1962. They hadn't done more than circumnavigate the, Yuri Gagarin had been the only one who had circumnavigated the globe at that point in time, and they're saying put a man on the moon, impossible, right? So the impossible is the most fun you can have in medical device development. Just go do the impossible. But those are the things that really impact patients too.
So that may explain why you're sort of in the ground floor of two disruptive technologies, the coronary stent and TAVR. Both met some skepticism early on. With stents, doctors thought that the stent would thrombose and the patient would suffer a heart attack. So I'm interested in hearing how you went about bucking the conventional wisdom and just go for it on these breakthrough devices.
Yeah, I think all of us have probably experienced some amount of skepticism, especially if you're doing something kind of bold and decisive. I mean, the idea that you go out and garner input from your customers is a fundamental and brilliant idea, right? And we should all do that. But there are points in time where customers, like Steve Jobs says, have no idea what they really want. Especially if you're doing something that's disruptive. They have no clue, right? And so when when balloon angioplasty was big and we started developing stents, I used to have cardiologists just tell me, you're going to kill people, right? You put stainless steel in someone's coronary arteries, it's a stupid idea, and you're going to kill people. And of course, TAVR, the experts in the field, were the cardiothoracic surgeons. And they had not a single good thing to say about TAVR, right? It won't work for a myriad of reasons. We treat all the patients, we have amazing outcomes. Maybe there's a very small niche market, but you're not going to make it work anyway. So it can be hard, it can be lonely when you're really doing something disruptive. But what you've got to do is to see these patients that have truly unmet needs. And when you focus on them and you see that, that's incredibly valuable. Whether you have a wonderful solution or not, don't give up on that. That needs finding, really understanding those needs of patients, especially those that are difficult to see. And that was certainly the case with TAVR. It was much more obvious with coronary stents that certainly the high rates of restenosis were a problem. They weren't a problem for the interventional cardiologists. They were a problem for the referring physicians and the patients, right? It was economically not great, and people want long-term stable outcomes. So going back, 40% of the patients going back for a reintervention is not a great idea. With TAVR, it was very different. it was, we treat all the patients. Well, guess what? They don't. And the multi-billion-dollar stupid question that no one asked was, why would I send a non-surgical patient to a surgeon? Right? The referring physicians are holding these patients. If they consider them to be non-surgical, why would I send them to a surgeon? Because, right, to a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Guess what surgeons do? They do surgery. They don't do medical therapy, right? They're there to do one really amazing piece of medical work, and that is cardiothoracic surgery. So if you send them, that's what they're going to evaluate them for. They don't send non-surgical patients. How big was that opportunity? Well, today, the estimate is it's about an $8 billion opportunity.
So how do you push through those objections and make them realize that?
Well, in some respects, so when they give you these very specific, it's one thing when people say, well, the patients aren't there. And I say, well, okay, I get it, right? Because, of course, they don't show up at your door because they're non-surgical. So you have to go back and look, right? You have to talk to cardiologists and referring physicians and understand, what's gone before to see those market opportunities. But in terms of the specific kind of technical feedback that you get, well, you can't take a heart valve and crimp it down, right? Because you'll destroy the tissue. You can't make something durable. You can't attach it well. You can't, all those very specific things that I was told. They become a list of things that you have to have good answers for. Think of it as this is your job, right? Okay, so you think every patient's going to have a stroke because I'm going to leave the diseased valve in place rather than cut it out, and I'm going to deploy this heart valve into this disease. And so it's going to fragment and all the patients are going to have a stroke. How do I answer that? Well, we did balloon valvuloplasty. We treated about 50,000 patients. What was the data around balloon valvuloplasty? Stroke rate was 4%, about the same as surgery. It doesn't sound like all of them are going to have a stroke. Maybe that's a risk I'm willing to take when I develop this technology, because there's no indication that that would be true. And by the way, that calcium is encapsulated in tissue. So why would that fragment if I'm going to do this? And most of the tissue, most of the calcium's on that outer surface, where as I'm going to do the intervention on the inner surface of the valve. So all those things, you need to think them through. I wouldn't ignore them. Those become a part of your list of things to address. It'll never be durable. Well, gee, we have standard methods of measuring mechanical durability, right? And if I can pass that, well, I got to feel pretty comfortable about it.
Going back to your days at Percutaneous Valve Technologies, you already had 3 huge strategics on the hook. How did you come to choose Edwards over those 3? And tell us a little bit about how that story evolved.
Sure. So of course, I got venture funding early on when I founded Percutaneous Valve Technologies, which was the first company to develop a percutaneous aortic heart valve. When I did a Series B financing, I went to my investors and I said, here's what I want to do. I want to have 2 strategics who lead my Series B financing. And they said, well, first of all, that's a stupid idea, but why 2? I said, well, because if one is involved, then everyone will look at them as really having a preferred position to buy the company and no one else is going to be interested. If I have 2, it looks much more egalitarian. So let me see if I can get 2 to lead. And indeed I did. I got Medtronic to invest, and they were a great company to work with. And then I got Boston Scientific to invest. And when I went out and licensed the Anderson patents right after my Series A financing, I extracted those patents from Hartport 3 weeks before J&J bought them. And so J&J also owned 3.5% of the company. So I had all 3 of those guys sitting on my board, and they were They were great board members, at least the Boston Scientific and Medtronic were. The J&J rep didn't show up very much. He wasn't, rather disinterested, I would say. Steve Osterly from Medtronic was the chief scientific officer. He sat on the board, and Paul LaViolette, who was the chief operating officer of Boston, sat on my board, and they were really great guys. I really liked them a lot, and we had a great time working together for about the next year before we sold to Edwards. So why Edwards? Certainly I was aware of Edwards. Edwards was the leading heart valve company in the world. So in September of 2003 at TCT, I called up Mike Musalem and I said, "Hey Mike, let's have breakfast together." Mike said, "Okay." So I sat down with him at TCT, and I did what any good CEO would do. But I was sincere about it. I said, you know, PVT should be an Edwards company. Mike said, "Well, why is that?" I said, "Well, because PVT offers the biggest risk and the biggest opportunity to Edwards." And so we talked about that, and I think Mike was kind of in agreement with that. But he didn't want to be a stalking horse for a bid war for PVT, which was logical because he couldn't win a bidding war with Medtronic or Boston Scientific or J&J. So I said, "Well, if I solve that problem for you, would you be interested?" He said, "Yeah." So I went back to my board of directors and I said, "You know, some of you guys are conflicted, so if I got an outside offer from somebody else, you'd have a conflict of interest in evaluating it. So why don't we create a subcommittee of the board to evaluate any external offers that we get?" I had a slightly hard time selling that idea to Boston and Medtronic. But I got them to agree, and that's the mechanism by which we could have a discussion with Edwards about a potential acquisition without it being squashed or, you know, giving Edwards a fair chance at buying it without creating a huge war. At the same time, you have a fiduciary responsibility to allow, you know, others to bid on the company. I can't just say privately, "Edwards, you get this," right? So when Edwards did make us a firm offer, they had the other companies had 72 hours to make a decision about whether they were going to lob in a competitive bid. And that was pretty challenging for them, but it was enough time for them to make a real bid on the company. So that's kind of how we ended up becoming an Edwards company. I did think this technology had its best chance for success in Edwards because that was core to their business. Edwards was the world's leading heart valve company. If anybody could add technology to what we had already done, it was Edwards. And the fact that Edwards had to go out and borrow money to buy PVT, I thought that was very positive. It meant commitment. And I wanted commitment. You know, when you're a startup, when you sell your company, it's not all over. Because you spent years developing something that becomes yours. It becomes very personal. And so you desperately want to see it succeed. I have a good friend who sold a technology to J&J, and he made a lot of money off of it. But they never developed it. And you know, I met him at a medical conference, and he spent 45 minutes just railing about the fact that his technology never saw the light of day. So if it's all about money, why would he care? Well, we all care. We're trying to develop something. We have a passion to do this. In startups and at Edwards in my advanced technology group, we have a real passion to develop technologies that help patients. And you know, you don't give up easily. You want to see it through. You want to see it create value for patients. That's what most of us are in this business for. It's to see it translated into the marketplace and helping patients.
So speaking of that and patients and bettering outcomes, you've spoken before about the difficulty of making the decision to do the first-in-human case for TAVR, and I was hoping you could take us back to that time and how you ultimately decided you were going to go ahead with that first case.
Yeah, so to set the stage, we struggled making the first TAVR devices. There were no predicates. Making the stent frames, no tubing existed. Nobody had ever compressed tissue before. We started with polymers, how to attach a collapsible and expandable frame, nobody had ever done. How to develop this procedure, how much radial force do you need? There were so many questions. But we worked our way through a lot of those, and we finally ended up doing a series of cadaveric experiments that made us more and more confident, and probably maybe 3 months before we were preparing to do our first in man. We were well down the road in validating a product towards first in man. Dr. Cribier called me up and he said, "Stan, I need the valve." I said, "Well, what do you mean, Alain?" He said, "Well, I've got a patient who's dying. I need this valve." I said, "Okay, well, tell me about it." And he said, "Well, this guy's 57 years old. He has a 10% ejection fraction. I didn't actually know you could live with a 10% ejection fraction. He was in cardiogenic shock, okay? You can't produce enough cardiac output to stay conscious, okay? Cribier's done balloon valvuloplasty on him, and he's gone back into cardiogenic shock. He has bad lungs. He has a failed aortobifemoral graft, so he's not even close to being a surgical candidate. He's been turned down by 3 surgical teams. And at 57, he's going to die if he doesn't get the percutaneous heart valve.
And he was obviously not a candidate for open.
Not even close. 3 surgical teams had turned him down. They wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. But why should we? Right? We're going to go try to save his life. He's going to die, and then the French regulatory authorities are going to crucify us for killing him. Really, you're going to work for 3 years on something like this, day and night, and this is your first case? A guy who's in cardiogenic shock and dying? Would you do it? It's tough. It's a really, really tough decision, So it kind of comes down to we had 2 photographs on our walls at PVT. Tony Lund's mother, who died of aortic stenosis. She didn't have an alternative. And Tony was a dear friend of mine from J&J. And Alain Cribier's mother. She had aortic stenosis and was not a good surgical candidate. She was still alive, but she needed an alternative. And those patients represented why we were working the way we were. We had a reason for this development that was so fundamental to what we were doing. And I thought at the end of the day, my God, this is why we created this technology. It's to save even one life, and this is our first opportunity. So I admit, I made a really stupid business decision in April of 2002. I sent my team up from Israel with a percutaneous heart valve to treat this guy who was dying in Rouen, France. And it was the ultimate in compassionate cases, right? And when we went in to treat him, of course, he just took a very light, not general anesthesia, but a sedative was given to him because he died with general anesthesia. And all the animal cases we had ever done were transfemoral, meaning we came up the femoral artery, but this guy had a failed aortobifemoral graft, so we couldn't come up that way. So we had to do this crazy procedure, right? We had to come up the femoral vein, come up to the right atrium, puncture through the right atrium, take a catheter around, make the turn from the left atrium into the left ventricle, take a snare into the left ventricle, grab the wire, pull it out, and pull the wire out the contralateral femoral artery. So we had a wire that went from the right femoral vein to the left femoral artery. You could do like this, it's body floss, right? And this is the rail by which we had to put in the first transcatheter valve. And it offers one advantage in that you approach the valve from the bottom, which makes it easier to get through, because if you come through aortic stenosis from the top, it's much more challenging because it's a rigid disease. So that offered some advantage, but this guy was so sick that when you came around from the left atrium into the left ventricle, you prop open the posterior leaflet of the mitral valve. And this guy can't tolerate mitral regurgitation, so he goes into asystole, which means what it sounds like. His heart stops beating. And while his heart is stopped, Cribier continues to take the valve up and deploys it into the aortic stenosis. And a few seconds later, he goes back into normal sinus rhythm. So it was a successful case, despite the drama. And this same guy who was ashen, gray, and dying sits up that evening and drinks a glass of champagne with Cribier and talks with him, because it's France. Don't you give patients champagne after every case? I don't know. So it was tough decision making, though, I can tell you. And we still struggle with that. When we develop a lot of new technologies, and who do you put the new technology in? You have to put it in somebody where the risk-benefit makes sense. And the risk-benefit means I have to treat high-risk patients with a brand new technology, still today. We can't avoid that because that's the ethical thing to do, but it makes it, very, very difficult. But it's kind of the price you pay for innovation, I think. It's hard to justify putting in a brand new technology that you can't really test well in young, healthy patients that have an alternative. So somebody has a better idea, I'd like to hear it. But that's kind of what we do, and it's difficult every time we do it. But I think it's still the right thing to do.
So that in that decision, you're sort of walking right up to the edge of failure. And I'd like to talk about the importance of failure in innovation, and maybe you could share one of the failures of your career that you look back on as something that was actually a step forward.
So, I talk about this sometimes about why big companies can't innovate, and I think the number one reason big companies can't innovate is failure. So how do you deal with it? I say if you're not failing, you're not innovating. So let's start with that, right? What's the success rate of venture capital? These guys who are experts in investing in early stage technologies. What, 1 in 12, 1 in 14 are real successes? A couple of break even and the rest fail. So if you're going to do real innovation, why would your success rate be any better? Which means you got to be able to kill projects. And no project team in my career has ever walked in my office and said, hey, we give up. We don't have any more ideas. We don't think this is going to work. It just doesn't happen, right? If they run into a roadblock, guess what? Those guys have 10 ideas about what they can do to fix it. And I expect that of them. But somebody's got to throw the flag. Somebody's got to say, hey, we're not going to do this one anymore. We're going to move on and do something else. So I think, part of the process of innovation means you have to be able to kill projects. You have to be able to take those engineers, have them still be motivated to go on and do the next thing, right? You have to be resilient. And, I've dealt with that in my career. I went to the FDA with the first coronary stent. There was one other stent that was actually approved for the treatment of subacute thrombosis or dissections, which meant as a bailout. You could use stents as a bailout. The Gianturco-Rubin stent by Cook was approved for that, and we thought, oh gee, that's a pretty low bar, we can do that too. And so we took our data, even though we were doing 2 randomized trials for the prevention of restenosis, we went in and asked the FDA for an approval for the same indication. And they said, no, I don't think so. Not that your data's bad, just that, we think you should do a randomized trial, knowing that we were doing randomized trials. So here we were, set up all these expectations at J&J. We were going to get an approval, went down with our PMA, go to panel, and the panel says, nope, come back when you have randomized data. I rode back from Washington, D.C. to New Jersey with the division president. Just him and me in that car. It was one of the longest car trips I've ever been on, because there was a good chance they were just going to shut down the whole division. But we pleaded our case, and they gave us an opportunity to go gather the data. I flew out the next morning to Rotterdam, the next morning. And we started a process for gathering the data from the stress trial and the Benestant trial. And in 4 months, we assembled the data to refile with the FDA. And those 2 studies were published back to back in the New England Journal of Medicine. And when we finally launched the coronary stent, we sold $650 million in the first year. Wasn't too bad. But it followed some really, really difficult times where we had to be resilient. We had to say, okay, suck it up, let's go after it, we can do this. And we didn't know what the answer would be. So I think, it's that interesting balance. When do you kill a project, and when do you just say, no, I think we can get there? Nobody's written that book yet. I'd love to see the rule book for when do you kill a project. It's a tough judgment call, but any breakthrough technology takes a huge amount of persistence to succeed, because there will be numerous times where you're going to go, I just don't know if we can make this work or not.
So, speaking of that, and looking ahead, what's next in transcatheter valves?
It's been quite a ride. Again, most people look at this, for Edwards, it's over $1 billion business already, growing very rapidly still. And again, projected to be maybe an $8 billion total marketplace by 2021 or 2025, I don't remember, but it's going to be a huge market, and that's just the aortic side. A lot of what we're doing now is focused on therapies for the tricuspid valve and the mitral valve to make those percutaneous options competitive with surgery, not just an alternative to surgery long term. And of course, in the aortic side, as it is, there's lots of opportunities to continue to improve the technology while we expand indications. We started with non-surgical patients, right? Patients who were non-surgical candidates and then really high-risk patients. And then we moved to intermediate risk patients, and now we're doing a study on low-risk patients, which really puts us at par with the indications for surgery. And each one of those has been randomized controlled trials, except, well, even including the non-surgical patient. So it takes time and it takes evidence. We've worked very closely for the reimbursement side, which is critical to this. But having the medical evidence to compel physicians having the medico-economics to compel payers, having long-term data that makes people comfortable with a long-term implant, and having a very high-quality system for making these products consistently are all really necessary. It takes quite a village to do this. And I'm proud to say we have about 800 biomedical engineers on our campus just a few miles from here. It's an amazing, talented group of people, and I'm really proud to work with them every day. We work very collaboratively with a lot of key physicians from around the world to make this happen. So I'm very optimistic about the future of this technology and kind of where it leads us into these new therapies. We're not just replacing these valves in the tricuspid and mitral, we're repairing them. And so doing repair systems under fluoroscopic guidance and echo guidance is kind of the next generation of these therapies, and it's something to pilot their development. It's fraught with the same kind of challenges we had before, which makes it just a ton of fun and very unpredictable about what obstacle we're going to confront next.
Well, Stan, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. This has been really great, and I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for your time.